The Beltway Live on September 15th, year of our Lord 2021. Good to have you with me this morning. A lot of news. Overnight, California decided to keep Gavin Newsom as its governor, with 62% of the state's precincts reporting. 65, almost 66% of voters chose to keep Newsom in office. 34% wanted him out. That means Larry Elder will be coming back to the radio studio. He ran a good campaign, juiced up the base, maybe helped future elections, but Gavin Newsom stays in office. There is a huge story that will take up most of the day. What did General Milley do, and when did he do it? And this is from the New York Times. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff called his Chinese counterpart in the final months of the Trump administration to reassure him that Donald Trump had no plans to attack China in an effort to remain in power, and that the United States was not collapsing according to Peril, a new book by Washington Post reporters Bob Woodward and Robert Costa. Milley called General Li Zucheng of China on January 8th, 2 days after Mr. Trump's supporters allegedly telling him things look messy, democracy can be sloppy sometimes, but that's the nature of democracy. We are 100% steady. If this happened, because I checked with my sources last night, the National Security Team did not know General Milley called China. The Deputy National Security Advisor, Matt Pottinger, wasn't on the call, as would be routine. The Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, General Stilwell, was not on the call, which would be routine. That will require General Milley to quit. He'll have to resign. If he went outside of the chain of command and called China without instruction to do so, he'll have to quit. I haven't seen him comment on it, or he'll have to be fired. That would be the most unconstitutional thing in the world. The government controls the military. We took 150 actions against China from the election forward, actions that would have been routine, many of which have continued by the Biden administration, including declaration of genocide in against the Uyghurs, that General Milley would have had no idea what he was stumbling into. We cannot have generals calling foreign adversaries, including our most hostile adversary, and just riffing with them. So if it's true, General Milley has to go. It would be a wholesale violation of the Constitution, and I can't imagine. I mean, Stanley McChrystal was fired and the war's momentum reversed in Afghanistan because some of his low-level officers insulted the vice president, now the president, Joe Biden. We've got to and there's never a question about the United States military being under civilian control. This would be the biggest such scandal. And they say he pulled a Schlesinger when General Haig and General Schlesinger agreed to consult on any unusual orders when President Nixon was in his final days. That has nothing to do with that. That is one American talking to another American, the first American, Haig, being the chief of staff to the president, talking to the Secretary of Defense. Chain of command, removed one chain of command, no foreigners involved. That's a big story. We haven't heard from General Milley yet, so I'm not going to say much more about it. Big story in the Wall Street Journal. U.S. spies see signs of al-Qaeda fighters returning to Afghanistan. It's remarkable they can see anything. They didn't see this collapse of Kabul. But that's what you're going to get. An al-Qaeda giant training camp with more sophistication, more weapons. And, of course, Tony Blinken was back on Capitol Hill yesterday, getting roasted, this time by more adept questioners. Here is Mitt Romney asking Anthony Blinken for the short form of the numbers, cut number 14.
How many of them, approximately, you said we don't know the exact number, but how many legal permanent residents are we convinced are still in Afghanistan?
We don't have an exact number, but it's in the
but a round number?
In the thousands.
Pardon?
In the thousands.
In the thousands.
Unfortunately, Senator Romney did not say 2,000, 20,000, but we left a lot of LPRs behind. And again, you know these people. They live next door to you. Green card holders. It's astonishing to me that we did that. A total abdication of America's guarantees towards not only American citizens, but its green card holders. Senator Barrasso got into it with Tony Blinken. Cut number 2.
You nearly dislocated your shoulder, though, patting yourself on the back for the great job you've done. I mean, just yesterday, you stated, we did the right thing by our citizens in working feverishly to get every one of them out. But you didn't get every one of them out. You've admitted again and again we're talking about over 100 Americans. The top priority must always be getting all Americans home safely.
Should have added and thousands of LPRs. Rand Paul also lit into Tony Blinken. Cut number 3.
I've advocated for an end to the Afghan war for over a decade. I'm glad it's finally over. But never in my worst nightmares could I have imagined that an administration would leave $80 billion worth of weaponry to the Taliban. Dozens of planes and helicopters, thousands of armored carriers, hundreds of thousands of automatic weapons, and worst of all, 13 of our brave young men and women.
Rand Paul himself, a critic of the Afghanistan war for years, roasted Tony Blinken. I can't imagine he sticks around either. He's been reduced to a mere shade of his former self, along with General Milley, if that report is true. The Department of Justice is aiding in the effort to turn the page. They've sued Texas, asking a federal judge to block the new Texas anti-abortion law. That's been up to the Supreme Court once, and they've said there's no standing yet. I haven't read the papers. I don't know what their argument is. We'll see if they come up. Pfizer is going to apply to give their vaccine to children as young as 6 months old, and I'm glad they are. I believe that vaccine will help reopen America very quickly because the COVID virus is reaching epidemic proportions across the United States. 4 out of 5 ICU beds are now taken up with a COVID patient in the United States. 4 out of 5. Israel says the coronavirus spread there has reached record heights, almost 10,000 cases a day. It's the average of 8,000 new infection a day, with occasional peaks over 10,000, is going to be bigger than their second wave, the one that hit last year. But good news from Israel, and we ought to just outsource the CDC, FDA, and NIH to Israel. A third vaccine dose produces 10 times more antibodies than the second. And yet they're still talking about it inside this administration. Over at CDC, they're confused and absolutely amazed by science. They are ridiculous. We got to get those boosters out. Meanwhile, the Democrats' tax plan is coming under heavy fire because it really crushes the middle class. It will crush ordinary Americans who bought a house, saved their whole life, paid it off, and want to leave it to their kids, accumulated some 401 and IRA and saved and played all by the rules. The Democrats want to do away stepped-up basis. They want to tax that house, make kids sell the house, make kids sell the IRAs, tax everything in sight. And they also want to ruin Medicare. Well, 3 Democrats already say they're going to oppose the party's drug price plan, which means they will lose in the House. And Democrats like Joe Manchin and other moderates are defecting from the tax hike plans. Call them and tell them to stop the tax madness. Inflation, meanwhile, has soared in Great Britain. Last month, it rose 3.2% in 1 month. Now, I don't think it's at 36% annually in Great Britain, but it just shows that it is soaring. Meanwhile, the Wall Street Journal has a story, what's your raise really worth? Inflation has something to say with it. For the lowest paid Americans, wages fell 0.5% when adjusted for inflation. This is because inflation is so hot in ordinary America, not the Beltway, not Silicon Valley, that it's destroying people's livelihoods. The Wall Street Journal lead editorial defining inflation down to something you ought to read as well. So, Democrats put off hard decisions on $3.5 trillion spending plan for now, according to the Wall Street Journal. They know they cannot pass taxes with this kind of an economy. A humiliating climb down, according to the Financial Times. A centrist Democrat chips away at Biden's tax plan. Richard Neal, a Massachusetts House member. New York, by the way, is going to lay out their maps today, but they're not the real maps. Gerrymandering is alive and well, despite what the left says in the Democratic Party. The real maps, according to the New York Times, are going to reduce the number of Republicans in New York State from 8 to 3 because they're going to gerrymander the hell out of it. And by the way, that's constitutional and fine. I just want Republicans to play hardball where they can play hardball. North Korea fired 2 ballistic missiles yesterday. Weaknesses provocative. Joe Biden is as weak as they come. North Korea is back on its old screw with the United States and scare them into giving us money. In Iran, Iranian guards, according to the Wall Street Journal, physically harassed female UN nuclear inspectors at their giant nuclear site more than 4 times in recent months. The Turkish government announced they're building a wall along their Iranian border to keep out Afghan refugees as refugees from that Biden disaster flood into Iran headed for Turkey. China's economic recovery is looking gloomier, according to the Journal. I can't even believe how much inflation is ripping apart the world, and inflation is, of course, being powered by us. The Brits are getting serious about Chinese, though. They've thrown the ambassador, banned him from Parliament. They don't want the new ambassador showing up anywhere. So that's the state of the world today. Today I'm going to talk with John Ondrasik, singer-songwriter behind Blood on Our Hands, which was censored by Facebook yesterday. Facebook refused to carry an ad for the provocative gut-punching song about America's disastrous and terribly embarrassing breach of faith with Afghans, LPRs, and American citizens. John Ondrasik joins me next on the Hugh Hewitt Show to talk about Blood on Our Hands. I urge you to go and watch it on YouTube. Just type in Blood on Our Hands, Five for Fighting. You'll go and see it. And then come back. John Ondrasik joins me from California, where Gavin Newsom is staying as governor after yesterday's vote. I'll be right back, America. Stay tuned. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt, joined by Representative Mike Gallagher, with whom I usually have some fun at the start, but we have some serious stuff to talk about, beginning with this story in the Washington Post, Congressman Gallagher, about General Milley, drawn from the new book Peril by Woodward and Costa. Now, you know General Milley. You're a member of the Armed Services Committee. You are a Marine. What do you make of this story? What possible response can he have short of resignation? What facts could change that would stop that from having to happen today?
Well, if it's true, it's one of the more serious allegations that I've heard regarding the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the chain of command in modern history. And I think if it's true, and again, we're operating off, I have no reason to doubt the reporting of Costa and Woodward, but that alone is not grounds for certainly legal action, but it is grounds for a thorough investigation, because the chairman of the Joint Chiefs does not get to freelance with our adversaries and undermine a sitting commander-in-chief. That simply cannot happen, and this can't be allowed to stand. So at a minimum, the relevant committees in Congress need to demand the release of documents, transcripts from the reported calls, and a full testimony before the House Armed Services Committee. And I don't know why General Milley has not yet publicly made a statement. I get that he is pushing back now. It appears Jennifer Griffin has some reporting that suggests this isn't true, that there were 15 people on a video teleconference call, including people from the State Department, and that there are readouts and notes from these two calls between Milley and his Chinese counterparts. Well, if so, these call notes, if these call notes exist, they should be requested by Congress. I would say this, Hugh, I think regardless of what we understand when we get to the bottom of this, General Milley, due to a combination of things, whether it's sort of his defense of woke ideology in Congress and some other things, has become very politicized. And I think it's clear to me that he is the one leaking a lot of this to a lot of people in the media, to thinking that this will portray himself in a good light, that he somehow saved the Republic at a time of profound peril surrounding January 6th. You simply can't have that. And it's very damaging to the chain of command. It also is just damaging to the general respect that Americans have for the military. And we are getting very close to politicizing the military at the top levels in a way that's going to do lasting damage to the credibility of American commitments and the effectiveness of American deterrence around the world. So we really do need to demand a clear denial, at least from Milley, and that's his only option. It's a full-throated denial or a resignation.
A full-throated explanation. He may have made these calls. Now, I spoke last night with a senior member of the Trump administration national security team who told me calls between the chairman and counterparts, including the Chinese counterpart, would not be untoward if they included either the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, the Assistant Secretary of State, General Stilwell, for East Asia Affairs, or Matt Pottinger, the National Security Advisor, Deputy National Security Advisor, in on the call, taking notes and having briefed Milley before the call occurred, because more than 150 specific actions were taken vis-a-vis China after the election, before the transition, into which Milley might not have been able to cogently weighed had he not been briefed by state or NSC staff. But if he was surrounded by the interagency protocols, that explanation will be sufficient to defend him. Do you agree with that assessment?
I do think it would be sufficient to defend him. I mean, I would have to know the details of the call, and certainly that all depends on the assumption that the national security team is, as a whole, still operating under the direction, or at least the commander's intent, of the commander-in-chief, right? Because you don't want a situation in which the entire national security team is going rogue, even amidst the unique circumstances of January 6th. But yes, I agree with your basic point. And I could see the value of having a direct channel of communication to the PLA. Obviously, we want to make sure that we don't have misunderstandings that lead to war, but we simply cannot have a situation where on his own volition, outside of the president's national security team, outside of the chain of command, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs is going VFR direct to his Chinese counterparts and assuring them that we are not going to take any military actions. That's just simply not something that can happen, and it directly undermines the authority of the commander-in-chief, if true. And again, we're operating off of a Woodward and Costa book. I have no reason to doubt their reporting, but I don't take it, as 100% fact. We have to do our own investigation. We have to get to the bottom of this because we can't have generals freelancing and going outside the chain of command.
Agree. So we need either an acceptable explanation or resignation by the end of the day. You also cannot leave a story like this lying around waiting for oversight in 3 weeks. That's because if he's a rogue general, he's a rogue general and it's got to go. But if he's not, then they can explain it fairly quickly. Now, Congressman Gallagher, we haven't got all the time in the world today, so I just want you to assess your reaction to Secretary Blinken's, I think, disastrous 2 days of testimony before the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee over Monday and Tuesday of this week.
Yeah, I thought it was terrible. I thought the fact that, actually, I thought Senator Ron Johnson from Wisconsin captured it when he talked about the disparity between the real world and the way in which Secretary Blinken portrayed this in his written testimony. The idea that the administration is still out there trying to spin this as a success and not acknowledging the fiasco of this withdrawal is actually offensive. And I think it should offend every American with an ounce of common sense. The fact that we still don't have precise numbers on how many Americans we left behind, how many SIV eligible Afghans we left behind, how many green card holders, how many LPRs we left behind. That should offend every American.
Can we stop there for a second? Can I criticize your colleagues, and I in both the Senate and the House? What does it take for someone to say, you said thousands of LPRs? Is that 2,000 or is that 25,000? I mean, why can't your colleagues follow up a question with a question? I mean, it was so frustrating to watch.
Yeah, I think that we need to send people to the Hewitt School of Cross-Examination. Maybe you could run like a boot camp for
well, it's not that hard. I mean, do you know how many thousands there are now after 2 days of testimony and 25 different questions? Do you, Mike Gallagher, member of Congress, know how many Americans within 10 and how many LPRs within 100 we have left behind?
I do not, which is remarkable to me.
That's a failure of Congress. That's a failure of Congress, man. That is not hard. I've been talking to you for 6 minutes. We've established that you don't know, and we could have established that Blinken didn't know in about 2 minutes.
Yeah, it really is a failure. And, the administration will say it's hiding behind the argument that, well, when people go to Afghanistan, they don't always register with the embassy, and then some people leave, and we don't know. It's just unacceptable. It's completely unacceptable.
So let me conclude. I want to ask you this in a big picture way. We have seen a catastrophe in Afghanistan. They beheaded an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old yesterday, and it's going to get worse. We have a new Post story that Al-Qaeda is already, Wall Street Journal story, Al-Qaeda is already reassembling in Afghanistan. They've got all this armament. We've got hundreds of American hostages, and LPRs are Americans, whether or not you call them citizens, they're Americans. We have a fiasco disaster in our hand, and we have an incompetent Congress. We have a politicized military. I don't recall being this alarmed since Jimmy Carter and the Soviets invading Afghanistan and the Iranian Revolution. And you're too young to remember that, but it's really a dark moment.
Well, Hugh, I'm not too young. The first time I ever came on your program, when I was a humble civilian with Ambassador Robert O'Brien, was to talk about an article that we had written together, which was an argument that Obama should learn from Jimmy Carter. Because the remarkable thing is that in the very late stages of Jimmy Carter's presidency, after the invasion of Afghanistan, after multiple foreign policy crises, after the Iran hostage crisis, he actually learned from the failure and started to do things differently and started to make investments in defense that Reagan then took up and increased and obviously perfected our strategy for defeating the Soviets over the subsequent decade. What we saw with Obama then was a complete unwillingness to learn from failure because he was blinded by progressive ideology and a sense of his own infallibility. And I worry we're going to see the same thing with Joe Biden, who may not be quite as self-confident as Obama was, but still wants to cement his place in history as even more progressive as President Biden, and seems to dig in even when confronted with manifest failures of foreign policy. And the fact that they're trying to spin this failure, pivot to their incredibly progressive and destructive economic agenda is very telling and very troubling. And I do think, whether it's Milley or Blinken or others, in order to be successful, they are going to have to admit that their current national security team is not appropriately constructed. And I think it would be wise for the president to go back to the drawing board and try and rebuild a actual bipartisan national security team. I think that's what the moment demands, because the threats we face, Hugh, I actually think are more complex than the late 70s. I think the challenge we face from China in particular is so complex and so difficult, it is going to take our best and our brightest, and it's going to take both parties rowing their oars in the same directions, and that's not happening right now.
It is not happening, and you're absolutely right, and I hope so. Add to the ideology the infirmity of the president, and we have a crisis. Mike Gallagher, Congressman extraordinaire from Wisconsin's 1st Congressional District. Welcome back, America. It's Hugh Hewitt. On October the 13th, I am going to be joined in Atlanta by Brian Wesbury of First Trust Portfolio, Alfredo Ortiz of Job Creators Network. Alfredo's going to a lot more places on the Job Creators Network bus tour, so go to jcnbustour.com if you want to find out where. But if you want tickets to hear Brian and I talk about the inflationary cycle we are in, and Alfredo to talk about job creators, go to am920theanswer.com. We're going to be at the Atlanta History Center. It's a ticketed event, and the tickets are flying out the door because it's only got a few hundred people in there. am920theanswer.com. Good morning, Brian. How are you?
Hey, Hugh, I am excellent. Good to be with you.
Thank you. I've got one story. It's jumping out at me from the Telegraph in Great Britain this morning. In August, in Great Britain, prices jumped 3.2%. Now, on an annualized basis, of course, that gets us up to the 38%. One explanation being offered by inflation deniers is, that's just the annual inflation rate for restaurants, cafe, and dancing establishments because we ran an Eat Out to Help Out campaign to help reopen Britain in August. I'm not buying that. 3.2% in 1 month, Brian, is catastrophic for Great Britain.
Yeah, we have, Hugh, we have inflation accelerating all over the world, and it's really based on two things, but one is the most important, and that is central banks around the world. So in the UK, it's the Bank of England. Here, it's the Federal Reserve, have printed and injected into the economy trillions and trillions of dollars and euros. And we have done that. At the same time, we have held back production. And so what we have is massive increase in the demand for things. Everyone has cash, but very contained and restrained production of things. And when you have a demand increasing and production being restrained, the end result is inflation. It happens every time.
It's a law. It's right. It's economics 101, right?
Yep. It's like when the apple finally breaks free of its limb, it hits the ground. It's gravity.
So, Brian, add on to
what
that.
Inflation is.
In Germany, they have an election in 2 weeks. It is likely to be a sharp swing to the left. Merkel being defeated. Merkel's coalition, she's retiring. Her coalition being defeated. They're going to go sharply to the left. And we're going to have a huge tax increase. I don't think this is even difficult to predict. We are going to have stagflation.
Yeah, I totally agree. You know, we're heading into the wilderness again. And Hugh, I mean, this goes back. The history of mankind is the battle between wealth creation, which can only be done by entrepreneurship and freedom, and the redistribution of that wealth, which is done by government. And whenever government gets more power, and today they're using climate change, they're using COVID, they're using inequality, they're using all kinds of different political arguments to get more power, and as government grows, the economy slows. That's the stag part of stagflation, and then as money is printed, because remember, when government interferes, they cause problems with the economy. So then they think they can fix it by printing more money, and then that causes the inflation. And so what we end up with is stagflation. Too much government holding down the economy, too much money trying to fix that. It's like giving somebody morphine after a car accident, right?
It is. When we see AOC go to the Metropolitan Ball, she's been comped a $30,000 ticket, and she wears a tax-the-rich gown. That is disintermediated from any kind of common sense. It's cognitive dissonance. But then when I say to them, the Wall Street Journal story headline this morning, what's your raise really worth? Inflation has something to say about it for the lowest paid American. The lowest paid American, real wages, fell 0.5% in August. They're screwing the working class, Brian Wesbury.
That's what that is what always happens. You cannot successfully redistribute the wealth in a country without causing massive economic problems, which then definitely affects those on the lower part of the income scale more. The economy only works for people when it's free, and you have to work. See, this is the thing: if we pay people to not work, we are literally undermining their ability to become rich. If you just sit at home and collect the government check, you'll never be rich.
You'll be dependent.
You become a dependent, and that creates inequality. The number one problem with inequality in America is that we have spent tens and tens of trillions of dollars trying to fix it. And what we have done is we've created a permanent group of people that we've made it harder for them to grow their wealth.
Wesbury on Twitter, Wesbury, and he and I will be in Atlanta along with Alfredo Ortiz of the Job Creator Network on October the 13th. Go get your tickets. AM920theanswer.com. You got to hear this at length, and we will do it at length. I'll be right back. A big hour ahead.
I think we have to protect Texas values if we're going to have America win overall.
You see, we are a freedom people, and I like the fact you went to Austin. You'll run into McConaughey down there if you haven't already. He's a freedom guy, too, and I think he's a Democrat. He's a freedom guy, and you might be a Democrat, too. I don't care. Most of my friends are Democrats. My question is, how do you get Texas to stay Texas if all the Californians bring their half-baked ideological extremism with them?
I'm probably, Hugh, I'm some liberty version of the moderate right, to be honest. But what's interesting is that Senator Ted Cruz would have actually lost his last election if only the people born in Texas voted. It's actually, you look at the numbers, it's over the last 20 years, people who have come here tend to be slightly more on the pro-liberty side, and they actually voted more for Senator Cruz as an example. So I think that so far that people are choosing to come to Texas because they share Texas values is pretty interesting.
I hope you're right. Virginia is trending very blue because of the growth of government, and that's why California went deep blue. Yep. It's just government grew at such a rapid pace. One of the consequences of that, of course, is one of the young engineers who you want to hire, they can't buy a house in California. I mean, they'll never be able to buy a house in California. I'll tell you the story of one young couple I know. She worked at Google, still does, for 6 years. He worked at Lockheed. They saved all of her money, and they were able to put a down payment on a little ranch Rambler after 6 years. Joe, that doesn't work for the American dream.
Oh yeah, no, it's definitely. Listen, it's definitely a problem in the Bay Area, and it's offensive. We had people working with us, pay pretty well, and if you're not making more than a few hundred K, you have to drive half an hour, hour and a half in one case for one group to come work with us, which is just unacceptable.
Well, this radio show has a 12 share in San Francisco, and it's 5:00 in the morning right now in San Francisco. It has a 12 share because people have to drive to San Francisco and the Silicon Valley from, an hour and a half away. That's just not a way to live. That's too much of your life in a car. Joe, tell me a little bit of... Go ahead.
Well, one thing I'm really bullish on, which I'm involved with, is with Elon Musk, his tunneling company. It sounds crazy to people, but I actually think that's one of the solutions here. If you could do much, much cheaper, more affordable tunnels, you could actually live middle-class lifestyle pretty far outside of the city. You can commute at 120 miles an hour underground, and that, directly to where you're going. It might actually solve these problems partially, at least. So I think California's too incompetent to ever allow us to build the tunnels, but I bet we're going to be able to build them other places and prove it out.
Well, that is exactly true. I was a land use lawyer in California for 30 years until I retired. At the same time, I was a broadcaster. Nothing big will ever be built in California again. Nothing, unless there's a complete revolution. Tell me about the Cicero Project, because this is what really attracted me. American Optimist podcast is fascinating. We'll come back in the next segment and talk about podcasting. But I want to know about the Cicero Project.
Cicero is a policy group that my wife and I and a lot of friends are involved in. And the basic idea there is pretty much every problem you see in our country, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, whether it's how you run the prison and criminal justice system. The lack of innovation in these areas is because the government's in charge of these areas, and they're not letting the best ideas compete and win. The way America progresses is the best ideas win and the bad ideas lose, and you try better ways of doing things, and those ways prevail. And when you have government running something, you don't have market forces, and you don't have transparency and accountability, it breaks these areas. And so what we're doing is we're going in at a state level, we're drafting legislation, and we're figuring out system-level ways for good ideas to win. Let me give you an example. In Texas, the technical schools, which is the vocational type schools, were not doing so well about 8 years ago. And they went in and they said, we're going to fund our technical schools based on the salaries of the students coming out. So what that did, it created transparency and it created an incentive for the schools to have to actually teach skills that mattered. After they put that law in place and that funding was tied to student success, the schools changed what skills they were teaching. The salaries doubled over the last 8 years coming out of these schools. And so there's laws like that we're drafting and we're bringing to a lot of states to try to make these areas actually have competition of ideas.
God bless you. That, by the way, in a nutshell, is indeed the answer, is that government suffocates innovation. And without innovation, all of the amazing advances in the United States of America do not get into the sectors where they are most necessary. But I'm a student of ancient Rome. Yeah, well, I'm a student of ancient Rome, Joe. You know what happened to Cicero? He ended up dead with his hands cut off and his tongue cut out, nailed to the wall
I probably should have called it the Augustus Caesar Institute, but that would have been a little bit too much for people.
Well, it's just that people who speak truth to power end up really pissing off power, and then they end up on the outside. Are you an optimist that leaders of both parties and those of no party at all will listen to an innovative public policy solution that's not tied to special interest money?
I'm an optimist that we can prove out these ideas with smart people on both sides. I'll tell you what, though, Hugh, it's frustrating. I get a lot of moderate Democrats who agree with these ideas, and the far left is very good at killing off any kind of accountability. I'm actually friends with a lot of prominent moderate Democrats, and they say, Joe, we have to do these things in the red states first. Just as an example, I shouldn't throw him under the bus, but I have a very proud moderate Democrat friend, and he's really interested in innovating prisons, because prisons, there's all sorts of ways that prisons can be run so much better and much more innovative, better ways for rehabilitating and for getting people jobs when they come out and for not radicalizing them. And he says, Joe, I'd love to do this in the blue states with you, but first we have to prove it in the red states, because my friends on the far left will kill your accountability. They'll kill your transparency. They don't want to hold government accountable. So unfortunately, we tend to have more progress right now for Cicero on the moderate red states, and then we're going to try to take those ideas to the blue states as well.
That's a good plan, no doubt. It's because you know how to roll out a beta and then move it to success. I'll be right back with Joe Lonsdale, his podcast, American Optimist. Don't go anywhere, because we need this on The Hugh Hewitt Show.